So, in my last video, I brought up the fact that if you write a good story, people are going to want more. And that was mostly me responding to what I usually hear when people say writers should just write a good story, bro. Don't worry about the other things. I also started using images of me playing video games in the background because YouTube is really dumb about copyright. That's probably going to be the norm from now on, especially in a video like this, because I'm going to have to keep video clips to a minimum. Today, I want to address another common complaint I hear about modern writing, and why the solution everyone presents just doesn't work. The problem is that Hollywood can't seem to write a character without obsessing over their race, sex, and other immutable characteristics, while people on the sidelines will say, just write good characters. First, let's give the people from the peanut gallery their due. Most of the character writing in Western media today is terrible, and it isn't just Hollywood, or Western animation, for that matter. A lot of print media today is packed with clumsily written characters, because for decades now traditional publishers only wanted to publish books that hit certain tropes, and entire genres either have to have a Mary Sue protagonist or they're not getting published. Unless you want to self-publish, which you should, but that's a topic for another video. And on the surface, with the constant browbeating of specific political topics regarding race, gender, sexuality, and a whole load of other issues, it's pretty easy to see why people think the solution is to just write a good character, and then glue their race, gender, sexual orientation, and liberal arts degree on afterwards. But the problem is, a good character should feel like a human being, and human beings don't work like that. I've actually put together a pretty good profile of people who think this is a solution to the bad writing coming out of most Western media today. They tend to either be really late millennials, born in the early 90s, or really early Zoomers, born in the late 90s. This is a group of people who grew up on reruns of Disney cartoons like DuckTales, eventually graduated to Gargoyles, and spent their formative years in a period of history that, at least in most Western countries, was almost magical. I am not joking here. The early 90s up until around 2008 were a weird period in history, not just in the United States but throughout the rest of the planet. America sneezes and the rest of the world catches a cold. Lately that saying refers to bad things coming out of the United States, but it didn't always. From around the early 90s to 2008, we had a brief period in US history where race didn't seem to matter anymore, and neither did gender for that matter. You could go to grade school and sit down next to a person who was a different color on one side, a person of the opposite sex on the other side, and you didn't even notice as you got busy finger painting. The question of why should I care about a person's race or sex was just bizarre. I've got more important things to worry about, like what color crayon do I want to use on this next coloring book page? You didn't really care about stuff like this because you had better things to do. Now, normally, nostalgia is the result of people looking back on the past with rose-tinted glasses, usually yearning for a time when we were younger, healthier, and still had the illusion of a bright future ahead of us. Most of which has less to do with the times themselves, and more to do with the fact that we hadn't gotten old, had people in our lives who still pretended to care about us, and hadn't had our souls crushed by the real world yet. But for once, the nostalgia of our childhoods isn't based on a false memory of what life was like when we were young. America, and by extension Canada, and most of the modern world really, was a much nicer, friendlier place back then. And we have to recognize that a lot of the media we consumed back then was a product of the times. You had books like the Harry Potter franchise, which paved the way for the young adult fantasy genre. You had the first of the superhero movies in the Spider-Man trilogy, which, despite the campiness, still holds up today. And for most kids, you had the best period in Western animation, hands down, cranking out shows like the 90s X-Men, the animated Batman series, Ben 10, Static Shock, Avatar: The Last Airbender, the good one, and of course, Teen Titans. Also, the good one. These shows would occasionally make an episode about racism and acknowledge that discrimination exists, but then they'd go back to focusing on the specifics of each character. Racism was treated like something rare and especially upsetting, and the target audience was expected not to know what it felt like because of how unusual it was at the time. And then the show would go on to another plot the next episode about a different problem. And, most important, the bigoted character who takes joy in the suffering of a member of another race was always portrayed as the one in the wrong.
Isn't it a little comforting to see a rich white guy get wrongly convicted for once?
I'm too distracted to enjoy it.
Yeah, that's something else that's changed. Today, most characters are written with some kind of heavy-handed identity politics and zero depth. And writing better characters does mean going beyond the literal skin-deep traits people are born with. Personally, I think that a lot of people who say that we should just write good characters are not just nostalgic for the days when a black kid and a white kid could be friends without the white guy being forced to apologize for slavery. I think that some people who say just write good characters genuinely think that they can turn the clock back to the culture and attitudes of the 90s. But I don't know if that time is ever coming back. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but most of the circumstances that made that culture possible are gone now, and it would take generations to replace them. For starters, as I mentioned in my Afrofuturism video, critical race theory didn't start in the late 2000s. The seeds were planted in the 1970s, and we're only seeing the results now. But even if that hadn't been the case, other problems were already brewing. My favorite superhero show growing up was Static Shock. When the superhero movie craze first came out, I really wanted DC to make a live-action film adaptation. And now I'm just glad they didn't. The show focused on Virgil Hawkins, a kid who gets exposed to a powerful mutagenic gas during a gang war that gives him and a whole bunch of other teens superpowers in an event known as the Big Bang. Throughout the series, the biggest antagonist in the show isn't a villain, or racism, or anything like that. It's gang violence. Gang violence got Virgil's mom, a paramedic, killed when he was a child. You can't punch gang violence. You can't blast it with lightning. And in the first episode, in spite of everything, Virgil gets exposed to the Big Bang trying to join a gang. Knowing how much harm they cause, knowing it's what cost him his mom, all because the gang wars had escalated to the point where no one felt safe anymore, and if Virgil couldn't beat them, he felt he had to join them. On one hand, you could completely understand why Virgil should be avoiding gangs as much as possible. And on the other hand, you could see why he would join one, because it honestly felt like the alternative was just be killed in the crossfire one day. Now, as you might expect, all of the villains who got their powers from the Big Bang had either been involved in the gang wars, or were very close to the facility where the Big Bang occurred. Many of these crooks were just plain trash. A lot of them joined the gangs for the same reason Virgil did. Most of the series ran on the question of, what would happen if the people that society normally treats like trash got superpowers? Now, in a lot of episodes, the conflict of the day might literally just be some 2-bit thug with powers, but where the show really shined was when it dealt with people who felt like they were trapped in villainy. The best episodes were the ones that found ways of showing people a way out. Now, most of the characters in this show were black or other racial minorities in America. They could have made every character besides Virgil white, and the show would still have been okay. But the fact that the characters were a wide range of ethnicities, most of them either black or Latino, made the series feel more real. It emphasized the fact that these people did not have a lot of options. Episodes like Sons of the Fathers made racism a focal conflict, but the entire series would not have been as good if they had just made good characters and glued the races on later. In the United States, there's a lot of debate about the problems facing black Americans. And while some of them are exaggerated or made up, others are very, very real. From the outside looking in, it can be easy to think that the problems in these communities are self-inflicted. There's the crime rate that destroys the economy inside cities, food deserts created by constant theft from all the grocery stores, tragically low literacy rates caused by dumbing down the education system, and of course, the rampant rate of single motherhood and broken families. Surely it's their fault for committing so much crime or having so many kids out of wedlock, right? But the reality is, communities don't commit crime. Individuals do. Individual criminals drive stores out of business, eliminating the job market and hurting everyone in their neighborhood, regardless of whether they've committed any crimes or not. It doesn't take very many criminals in a community to ruin it for everyone else. Single moms may have made bad choices along with their absent fathers, but the kids of these families didn't do anything to deserve this. The kids in schools who aren't teaching them any useful skills, actually that's a nationwide problem, but the kids too young to vote didn't have a say in the matter. And on top of it all, the average kid born into these conditions doesn't understand why his life seems so terrible. What he does know is that specific racial groups in America seem to have most of the best jobs, the best education, live in neighborhoods with fewer crack houses and mass shootings, and have most of the two-parent households. Getting people to understand why inequality exists can be pretty hard. Getting people to care about why things aren't equal is even harder. Most people don't care why inequality exists, they just want it to not exist. Or, failing that, they want it changed so that the inequality benefits them. Now, if you've listened to Yuri Bezmenov's 1983 speech, you might know that the Soviet Union was deliberately trying to stoke up racial tensions during the Cold War. And it is tempting to think that if it weren't for Gorbachev fabricating the idea among the United Nations that the Native Americans were environmentalists who lived in harmony with nature until the evil nation of America was created on their land, Or if the black nationalists that formed critical race theory hadn't been allowed to infest America's universities, or heck, even if Barack Obama hadn't been elected president and added fuel to the racial tension fires while he was in office, that we'd somehow still have the pleasant race relations of the early 2000s. But the more I keep looking at the circumstances that made that world possible in the first place, I just can't believe that anymore. Too many problems were already simmering under the surface, ready to boil over. Critical race theorists and Marxist professors just took advantage of these situations. They didn't cause them. Of course, even without race tensions, we have gender conflicts today that we didn't have during the golden years. A lot of people will try to blame feminism for this, and while feminism has definitely played a role in turning men and women against each other, I honestly think that was more of a symptom than the actual source of the problem. I think the real reason men and women have entered a state of Cold War with one another is because of a completely different F word. Friend zone. I know, this is the part where most women are going to click off the video. Please bear with me, I am going somewhere with this. Now when I say friend zone, I am exclusively referring to cases where you have a boy and a girl, they both happen to trust each other and are comfortable in each other's presence, the guy realizes that his female friend is also cute, and when he asks her out, she responds with something like how she just wants to be friends, or doesn't want to ruin their friendship, as if it wasn't ruined the moment he developed romantic feelings for her. I know people use the term to mean other things, but this is the version that matters. I am also aware that women can be friend-zoned too, but the problems that started to brew in the 2000s and then boiled over in the 2010s came from men being friend-zoned by women. I've spent enough time talking to women from previous generations about their friend zone and asking for their opinions, but instead I discovered that every woman from Gen X or older doesn't even understand what the friend zone is. The closest a woman in an older generation seemed to get to the concept is when a guy in her friend's circle was waiting around for her current boyfriend to drop dead. Or maybe the guy they knew who worked at a hobby shop well into his late 30s after getting an art major who always smelled like Doritos, and never understood why women didn't want to go out on dates with him. Keep that in mind. These kinds of losers were getting rejected by women in their friend circles already. That wasn't new. That didn't change. Heck, Control Freak from Teen Titans is arguably one of these types of guys. But the idea of a woman rejecting an engineering major or a law student who had job prospects lined up, who she also knew was trustworthy and reliable, that's not something most Gen X women I spoke to could wrap their heads around. And it gets worse when you ask a boomer, or any of the few women from the silent or greatest generations who are still around. See, the primary way that people used to meet their significant other was by being friends with them first. This allowed men and women to actually vet the people that they were going to let into their lives, and judge them on the qualities of character rather than just their looks. Everyone benefited from this, because men and women got to examine whether the people they might want to date were actually honest, decent human beings whom you might want to have in your life at all before even considering dating them. If you're watching this and are either too old or too young to have lived through the dawn of the friend zone, it works something like this. Say that you applied to a job at a company, and when you went to the interview, the company said that they weren't going to hire you. You had all the qualifications the company was looking for, you'd be the perfect candidate for the job, and they even know you well enough to know that they didn't have to do a background check. But they weren't going to hire you. They're probably going to hire someone else who's less qualified, isn't as trustworthy, possibly abusive, and maybe even an alcoholic. But they will never hire you. They do, however, wish to keep in contact with you so they can complain about the abusive alcoholic they hired instead. Now, to be fair, there are good reasons not to date your friends, like if you're recovering from a bad breakup or you're just not in a good place at the moment. But if that was all that was going on, things wouldn't have progressed the way that they did. And of course, most millennial women that I know will tell you that they only friend-zoned guys who were entitled losers, like Hal Stewart from Megamind. And in the interest of giving them the benefit of the doubt, I will presume that women genuinely believe, in their minds, that these guys were the only types that were getting snubbed. And there is no way in hell that these were the majority of guys women were putting in the friend zone, because Gen X and the boomers did that too, and the dating scene didn't fall apart when they were dating. Now, you can tell people that they aren't entitled to a girlfriend, or a boyfriend for that matter, and you're technically right. But telling people that they aren't entitled to the things that they want, and in this case, often need in order to be happy, doesn't make them want to give up. It usually just makes them double down and try harder, or try something new and rather drastic. If at least 1 out of every 10 guys trying to date one of their trusted friends was able to find a healthy relationship, the modern dating scene would not be the nightmare hellscape it is now. Because if guys were still having at least a 10% success rate with the friends to lovers pipeline, and every loser had a clear path to improve themselves and become the men they needed to be to get a girlfriend, men would not have resorted to the expensive, time-consuming response they turned to instead. The 2010s was the age of the pickup artist. There were guys like this before, but the sheer explosion of internet gurus trying to teach men how to become players hit at around 2015. Men had figured out that the best way to avoid the friend zone was to avoid being friends with women. And if women wanted to date assholes, by golly, men were going to spend a butt ton of money and a whole lot of hours taking classes on how to become assholes. Sometimes from a guy in a really stupid hat.
When you wander over that way and wear a stupid hat, then you help some stupid people and wear a stupid hat.
This is how we ended up with an entire industry of guys who made a living teaching men how to treat women like disposable tissues. It's how the online porn industry, which had already been around for years prior, grew into a massive empire that fed on a sea of new addicts. It's how OnlyFans blew up. It's how we ended up with Andrew Tate. No relation. And again, loser man children have always been around. If it was just the Hal Stewart types getting friend zoned, nothing would have changed. Those guys were always there, and lazy loser man children do not have the money or the drive to get off the couch and take a class on how to riz dem hoes. Oh, for crying out loud, even our language has been destroyed by the friend zone. Back in my day, we didn't have your fancy skibbity toilet riz. If we wanted to ruin our brains, we had to watch the Disney Channel and eat Tide Pods until Hannah Montana looked like quality entertainment. But remember when I said that the whole friends to lovers thing let people check if someone was a decent human being before dating them? Well, that had the side effect of giving people an incentive to be a good person. The only way you were going to get a date is if you treated the opposite sex like the human beings that they are.
Not anymore.
Turns out, you can't just sleep with a girl from your friend circle and then throw her away along with the condom. I mean, technically you can, but good luck getting invited to Friendsgiving after that. But total strangers? There's nothing stopping men or women from treating people they just met as disposable, which is what a lot of them did. It wasn't long before men and women started to view each other as predators, and what followed was what I can only describe as a dating arms race between the sexes. And what we have now is a society where men don't even want to approach women anymore, and a quarter of women have reported that they actually prefer it that way. Even churches, and I'll get to churches in a bit, have started taking actions to ensure that men and women do not meet each other. I hear people talk a lot about how there's a male loneliness epidemic, but if you look up the stats, women are doing just as bad. And yeah, some of it is self-inflicted, just like with the guy who sits on the couch and never moves out of his mom's basement. But there are also a lot of women who did not choose this. If you're a woman and a Zoomer, you did not uncork the friend zone onto society. The genie was already out of the bottle by the time you were an adult. Zoomer girls didn't make the mess, they just inherited it. And again, the common response people seem to have to this problem is usually something like, well, you're not entitled to a girlfriend or boyfriend. And this is true, on paper. It's also true that people can die of loneliness. Your organs can literally shut down as a result. Your psychological needs are just as important as your physical ones, and, like it or not, this is too important for most people to ignore. Remember in Teen Titans and Young Justice how you had teams of teenage boys and girls living in the same housing, hanging out with each other, comfortable in each other's presence? It wasn't even that the girls were necessarily tomboys or one of the boys. They were still able to be girly and be part of the friend circle. None of the girls were constantly on edge in the company of the guys. None of the boys had to set up a video recorder to monitor every room in case someone was accused of something they didn't do. Remember when that was a joke in Simpsons? And now it's something that people, including myself, have started doing for real because it's our last line of defense? And the really sad thing is, the culture where people were comfortable in each other's presence is not the default state for human society. It was the exception. In order to build that, it took decades of relatively low levels of crime, generations of high social cohesion and trust, and most important, people having clear pathways that they could take to pursue the lives they wanted to live. If you were a man and you wanted to find a wife and build a family, from the 1900s to the early 2000s, there was a clear course of action, and the same was usually true for women. Before that, people had to have chaperones on dates, and earlier on there were arranged marriages. In order to tell someone who is trying to do everything right and still struggling that they're not entitled to a relationship, you first have to develop a level of callousness towards not just that person, but to the very idea of trying to find a partner in the right way, since you're effectively treating people who have noble intentions as if they were no different than the pickup artists who treat women like disposable fleshlights. That lack of empathy is incompatible with the social cohesion we need to make this safe, comfy society of the 90s and 2000s a possibility. And it's a bit like having a hungry tiger sitting across the table from you, and right now it's asking you nicely to either give it food or help it find food. You can tell the tiger that he's not entitled to food, and you'd technically be correct, but that doesn't solve your problem. There's going to be a little voice in your head saying, hey, if this animal doesn't find food, sooner or later, we are the food. It doesn't matter if it's a guy and he never does the thing that every woman is afraid of. The fear is lodged into her brain, and just like that, the social trust goes right out the window. You know how when a man approaches a woman and she thinks he's unattractive, she might run to the nearest authority figure and complain? And I don't mean she videos it and whines on TikTok. I mean the ones who are genuinely afraid because a guy they're not attracted to came up and tried to say hello to her. Well, in real life, if you had a hungry tiger on the loose, you'd call animal control. And in the mind of a woman who knows there's a struggling guy in the area, he's not a human being. He doesn't have a mother, he's not someone's kid, he's a dangerous animal who needs to be locked up.
What are you doing?
Sitting down, sir.
What, at the table?
Sterling.
Like people?
Sterling!
What? Look, he thinks he's people.
This is what I meant when I said that things like feminism are a symptom, not the cause of the breakdown between the sexes. Remember the episode in Teen Titans where Raven gets manipulated by Malchior into breaking the curse trapping him in a book? And it's obvious throughout the episode that Malchior is using the fact that Raven has a crush on him to keep her from poking at the holes in his story. Like, if she wasn't blinded by romantic feelings, she would have figured him out sooner. That episode worked as well as it did by leaning into the fact that Raven was a lonely teenage girl. If you flipped the genders and had a story with an older female mentor manipulating a teenage boy, we kind of get the sense that the guy would have eventually decided that this cougar just isn't worth the work and would lose interest. Men in general are less interested in older women. And on the other side of things, one of the most iconic characters from 2023 was Ken from the Barbie movie. The movie didn't intend for this. It was meant to be a feminist film about girl power against the patriarchy. Ken was accidentally a good character, and it was partly because of his sex in a film that tried to portray him as a villain and a loser. Instead, he ended up becoming the poster for a popular rallying cry for men in the modern world. That was a case where the writing team started with the sex and then built a good character around that sex. By accident. And have you noticed how rare it is to see healthy relationships in media today? Disney hasn't done a love story in an original movie since Frozen. And in cartoons, I can only count a handful of healthy relationships that I've seen in either mainstream animation or web animation, most of which were made by VibsyPop, and only one of those couples is heterosexual. I don't think this is just left-leaning writers with a gay agenda. Some of it might be, but I think a lot of writers today are just following the old rule of write what you know. Today, people know fewer and fewer healthy relationships, and it seems at times that gay and lesbian couples might actually have an edge over people who have to get along with the opposite sex in order to find a date. And that leads me nicely to the next point. The 90s and 2000s were great for a lot of people. Race relations were the highest they had ever been in the country in recorded history. Women felt safe around men felt comfortable around women. But you know who the golden years weren't great for? Anyone in the alphabet soup community. If you were gay or a lesbian, you were an outcast, and you formed a clique with other outcasts. And this is one group of people born and raised in the golden years who I never hear say, just write good characters. Because those people understand that your identity does play a critical role in who you are and how you turn out as a person. I don't actually have too much to say about how things were for the gay community because I didn't hit puberty until things were starting to change, so I don't remember everything that was going on. Some of it was exaggerated, some of it wasn't. However, I do believe it plays into why we lost what we had, which I'll tie together at the end of the video. Another reason why the culture of the Golden Age fell apart is because the economy started to fall apart. And while there were a number of reasons for that, one of the biggest problems was the college rush. If you were a millennial, even if you were on the tail end like I was, your parents, your school, the job market, and anyone else that I missed told you to go to college if you wanted to be somebody. If you didn't go to college, you were going to be poor for the rest of your life and have to work at McDonald's or some company that didn't care about you and would only use you up until you had nothing left to give and then throw you away like an injured horse. Yeah, wow. Just writing the script for this video made me realize the irony of that logic. Especially since, when I was in high school, I couldn't even get a job at McDonald's over the summer because every fast food chain within driving distance of my parents' house was only hiring people with college degrees to flip burgers. I'm not kidding. I've never been able to take a side in the student loan forgiveness debate. On the one hand, there's no such thing as debt forgiveness. There is only debt transfer. But on the other hand, the very same people telling millennials that they've got to pay back their loans are often the same people who duped those kids in going into debt in the first place. Of course they're not going to trust you. And the response that Gen X and boomers usually have to millennials who are drowning in debt from student loans they shouldn't have been tricked into signing is usually something like, well, when you were a teenager, you should have been smarter than all the adults in your life. You should have known better than to respect your elders. Yeah, how did you think that was going to go? Are you really surprised that so many of the college kids turn out to be socialists who will vote for any doofus promising to forgive their loan debts? Do you think maybe it has something to do with you telling them that capitalism is where you can scam people into outrageous debts and then the scammers get to keep the money? You think that might be part of the problem? But the last topic I need to talk about is the utter decay of the Christian church. Not just Christian hegemony, but the church itself has taken a nosedive in quality. I have mixed feelings with how the church handled the issue of homosexuality. However, that's because of a disagreement in how we interpret scripture. And while conversion therapy might seem cruel today, the fact of the matter is that if you genuinely believe that your child will go to hell for being gay, unless you find a way to fix him, conversion therapy starts to sound like a kindness. Misguided, maybe, but still coming from a place of love. But I would take the Bible-thumping conservative Christians of the Bush era over the majority of Christians we have today, who are the worst kind of cowards. Christians in the Bush era had conviction. Today, I can count on one hand the number of pastors I know who still believe in anything besides the offering plate. I've seen a lot of people lately complaining about Kenneth Copeland, a televangelist who won't take commercial flights because he thinks people who ride coach are apparently demons, and he has enough money from scamming people across the country that he can afford a private jet. In reality, the only difference between this guy and the majority of pastors I've met in the last decade, besides the fact that he seems to be made out of foam rubber, is that he's more successful at scamming people out of billions of dollars. A particularly disturbing pattern I keep seeing in churches today is where pastors are really interested in helping people who are struggling with problems like drug addictions or a bad relationship that make for great stories in a video confession right before a baptism. These are usually problems the church can theoretically solve with love bombing and the illusion of a community. The baptism video is then used as free advertising to bring in new people to the church, some of whom will then toss money into the offering plate. But if you have a problem that can't be solved by singing worship music or volunteering at a soup kitchen, and especially if it's a problem that churches have historically been the place to turn to, but there's nothing in it for them, they're not interested. It could be anything from the dating issue that I mentioned before, trying to find employment, trying to deal with the fallout of a bad divorce where the other person chose to leave you. Doesn't matter, there's nothing in it for them. Now, normally if you can't help someone who's asking for it, just saying so is usually enough. There's a big difference between I can't help you and I just don't want to help you. But in the church's case, they don't want to do that because it sounds like saying God can't do something. And we can't have that now. And the problem with this is that the church is the biggest institution in America that was founded around the idea of helping people in need. Now it's become an institution that is at best looking for transactional relationships with the congregation, or worse, an all-take-no-give relationship. There are a lot of people who think that the culture of the golden years was the product of our success, that our economy was really strong at the time, and we were only polite and respectful of one another because we were all rich and happy. That's backwards. We were rich and happy because we had previously treated each other, for the most part, with a baseline level of respect. We lost that culture because we somehow convinced ourselves that other people's suffering wasn't our problem, until it became our problem. And it's ironically that same lack of empathy that prevents people in Hollywood and the mainstream media from making quality characters. In order to write a good character, you have to know what motivates them. You have to know where they fall in society's hierarchy. If you don't think that matters, congratulations on having been born to the middle class. You also need to know what options this character thinks they have. How many places can they go where they would reasonably feel safe? And which places are those? Try walking into a church with a congregation that is entirely made up of people who don't look like you. Just do it once. It's an experience, let me tell you. Whose company do they feel safe around? What risks do the character think about? What are their goals? What obstacles do they expect to face? What obstacles will they face they don't expect? What ultimately makes them tick? And this goes as much for villains as it does for heroes. A big complaint I keep hearing about mainstream media villains is that they're somehow easier to root for than the heroes. Let's leave Adam from Has-Been Hotel out of this. I suspect that he was made with hidden depths deliberately. But Ken, from the Barbie movie? I guarantee no one working on that movie ever asked what it was like to be a homeless piece of man candy. That's effectively how he starts the movie, and his desire to get out of that state is way more relatable than the creators intended. People rally behind this guy. In real life, "You are Ken-uff" is still a popular slogan. At the end of the day, the only way to create good characters is to learn about real people. And that often means going out and talking to people in the real world. Scary, I know. You're gonna have to go out there and touch some grass. But that's the only way. A person's immutable characteristics should never be the only things you focus on, but you're not gonna be able to completely ignore them either. Alright, this video's gone on long enough. Hit that like and subscribe button, and I'll talk to you all again soon.